I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Heads Up for Wednesday, the 20th of May, and I'll be back with last call for you at 4 p.m. today. To the dairy industry, increased milk production through intensification has not returned a comparable increase in value to the average dairy farmer, as exponential rises in feed costs erode New Zealand's traditionally low-cost competitive advantage. So says Dairy New Zealand's principal scientist John Roche, having analysed the profitability of dairy farming since 2001. Dr. Roche says farmers are no more profitable now than 10 years ago had they stayed doing the same thing, milking the same number of cows and running their farming systems the same way. Whereas other dairy farming costs such as labour, maintenance, fertiliser and animal health have largely stayed consistent with inflation, the rocketing up of feed prices since 2007 and 8 has eaten into farmers' margins. Dr. Roche says that as the milk price has gone up, farmers have given more feed to their herds, thereby increasing demand on and cost of feed. He says farmers need to reassess their systems and see if they are truly making more money from more intensive systems, or whether they should take a step back in terms of intensity and look at removing feed and or reducing their stocking rate. Dr. Roche says the top 20 to 25% of farmers have probably done very well by making some of these changes, but the average farmer hasn't. However, for the right operator on the right land at the right price, there is still a huge opportunity for investment in dairying, no question about it. The effective plateauing of profit based on the average of averages flies in the face of the upscaling of intensity in this country's dairy industry in the decade to 2012. During that period, national milk solids production increased 53% as the land allocated to dairying increased 26%. Although herd numbers declined 14%, it was more than compensated by a 60% increase in average herd size. Average stocking rate in this country increased 9%, while milk solids production per hectare lifted 16%. Dr. Roche says the trend line for such intensification over the decade, as well as profit margins for dairy farmers, have remained largely consistent since 2012. Asked if the profit plateau could augur poorly for the growth of the national milk pool, Dr. Roche replies that it instead raises concerns about the resilience of the dairy industry in this country. He says a decade ago we had a fairly consistent milk price. It varied but not enormously, whereas now we're seeing massive volatility of a true commodity. Up until 2007, a $300 shift in powder prices in a year was regarded as a volatile year, whereas that level of volatility can now happen on a fortnightly basis. In People News, Phil O'Reilly, the long-serving Chief Executive of Business New Zealand, will leave the lobby group at the end of the year, ending a decade providing one of the most vocal voices for the country's private sector. The Wellington-based lobby group will immediately begin its search for a replacement, and Mr O'Reilly says he will help the Business New Zealand Council find a suitable replacement. He will stay chairman of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD and member of the governing body of the International Labour Organisation until the end of his terms in mid-2017. Mr O'Reilly said in a statement, "Over the next few months, I will look forward to discussing future business and career options with a variety of people. I have no concrete plans for what might happen next, although I will investigate taking on a small number of directorships and engaging in consulting work in New Zealand and internationally." Business New Zealand is the umbrella organisation for the Employers and Manufacturers Association, Business Central, Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce, and Otago Southland Employers Association, and gained traction in lobbying government after the Business Roundtable fell out of favour with the previous Labour-led administration. Mr O'Reilly says he will talk to the boards and advisory groups he currently sits on to figure out his future with them. The lobby group was incorporated in November 2000 to represent the interests of New Zealand's business and employing sectors to the government and wider community. It generated about $2.1 million from major company group levies and $2.1 million from regional levies in the year ended June 30, 2013, according to its more recent financial statements lodged with the company's office.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 19th. I'm John Stewart. I'm with Jason Walls, who's been covering a report by the New Zealand Initiative on charities. What did this report find, Jason?
Well, it was a very interesting report. I mean, anything that mentions the word charities usually sparks my interest. But this one was basically shining a light on New Zealand's charity sector, and it found that some 700 limited liability companies on the charities register generate more than $370 million of tax-exempt profits a year. So basically, the report was called The Giving Charities a Helping Hand, and it was put together by the New Zealand Initiative, and it kind of calculated that the government forgoes about $104 million of fiscal revenue every single year.
Have you seen this happening before?
Well, it's something that NBR has covered a little bit in the past. One of our other reporters, Campbell Gibson, broke the story earlier in this year around how the Christian charity Parachute Music were producing the backing music for X Factor.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
And it was a very interesting story. And some of the sources that he was talking to said that Parachute were able to undercut competition from the other music production studios because of their tax exemption. So this is quite an interesting argument here. We also had a tax accountant from Staples Rodway called Mike Rudd tell us that it's not actually as simple as Parachute undercutting competition due to tax exemptions, but the charity could actually reduce costs in other ways. So what the report was saying, and I've been talking to a man called Jason Crump, and basically he was telling me that there's actually little oversight in how some of the cultural and religious charities spend some of the funds, simply because there's legislation that allows religious and cultural organizations, and what he said was essentially to get a free pass.
Any other culprits in this, apart from the ones you've mentioned?
Well, in the report, he mentioned quite a few different people that were involved. For example, New Zealand Swim were one of them. But one of the ones that he really drew my attention to was the Ngāi Tahu. And he said that they have roughly 38 business units, which are all registered charity, but none of them are actually paying any income tax. And he said, and I'm quoting him here, in our research, we found that the organization made $160 million in tax-free profits in 1 year, and only distributed about 20% of that to the charity. So that means that there's $140 million banging around in their balance sheets that's tax-free, and that has the potential to create unfair competitive landscape.
So how's this affecting some of the smaller charities?
Well, that was the other point on the report, because it also pointed to some of the unfair ways that it was stacked against some of the smaller businesses. So in the last 10 years, there's been a whole lot of change in regulation to do with charities. Basically what happens is that if you give to a registered charity, you get a 33% tax write-off. And they also get discounts on tax and things as well. So what happens after there was a big review of the legislation, and a lot of the charities were under review, and the regulators had to go back and look at them to see if they actually did have charitable status. And a lot of them were, what Mr. Crump was saying, was they were unfairly taken off this list. And what that looks like, it was for a lot of trivial reasons. And a lot of them, the high-profile ones and the ones that had enough resources were able to go to the Court of Appeal and appeal this decision. And it was eventually turned around. In fact, in one instance, they just said, well, this is the facts. And the Court of Appeal said, okay, they didn't do anything different from what the regulators did, but they said, okay, we're going to give you a charitable status back. But they were one of the lucky ones, because essentially a lot of the smaller charities within New Zealand don't have the resources to be able to take this up and hire things like lawyers. So he was telling me that often what happens is some of these charities just have to liquidate and just give all the money back to different charitable causes, because it looks, for starters, if you get taken off the charitable registers list, it looks really bad, despite the fact that you might not have done anything wrong.
Thanks very much for that, Jason.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
While you were sleeping, world stock markets continued to rise overnight as the US dollar strengthened and oil and gold prices slipped. On Wall Street, both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 hit new intraday highs after setting new records in the previous session. However, prices wavered near the close. The Dow ended up 0.1%, the S&P 500 slipped 0.1%, the Nasdaq lost 0.2%. US housing starts rose 20.2% in April from a month earlier to an annual rate of 1.135 million. This was the highest reading since November 2007. European stocks surged after the European Central Bank said it would moderately front-load purchases in its bond-buying program. Germany's DAX rallied 2.2%, France's CAC 40 advanced 2.1%. In Asia, stocks rose in China after Beijing approved 6 rail projects, amounting to a total investment of around $40 billion and said it would speed up reform in the finance sector. The Shanghai Composite Index finished up 3%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index was up 0.4%. Japan's Nikkei stock average ended above the 20,000 mark for the first time in 3 weeks, but Australian stocks fell a second straight day. Oil prices tumbled as the US dollar strengthened and signs pointed to continued oversupply in the global crude market. Gold prices ended a 5-day rally as the US dollar surged. Let's look at labels. New phone scanning technologies could add a new angle to country of origin labelling, which has traditionally been a voluntary practice for use as a marketing tool, even though it's required in Europe, North America and Australia. The issue flared earlier this year in Australia over frozen berries imported from China. The Australian Country of Origin Labelling, or COOL, standard, which commenced in 2006, requires mandatory labelling on all packaged foods, fish, pork and fresh whole or cut fruit and vegetables. There are also guidelines for the use of the terms product of Australia and made in Australia. Since then, a raft of public views, both legislative and regulatory, have attempted to clarify the laws. The Food Standards Authority of Australia and New Zealand recalled the Nana's brand of frozen mixed berries imported from Chile and China after links were found to a hepatitis A outbreak. In this case, the packaging contained the words packaged in Australia in large print and made from local and imported ingredients, although the large majority of the berries were imported. The affair prompted calls from the government to take yet another look at its COOL requirements under the food standards codes. Typically, product labels contain statements like made in and product of. But what does made in whatever country from mostly local ingredients mean? Does more than 50% of the product need to be from the specified country of origin? These statements generate the most confusion among shoppers. In New Zealand, a food bill was put forward last May to make COOL mandatory. However, the policy of successive governments has been that COOL across all food types should remain voluntary. This is primarily because the costs are believed to far outweigh the benefits to consumers, although an exception is made with wine. For other industries, the NZIER did a cost-benefit analysis in 2005. It showed the relabelling costs alone were likely to be about $60 million in the first year and could have been as high as $110 million. An alternate means of promoting the use of COOL is through the Buy New Zealand Made Industry Certification Scheme. Its distinctive trademark of a kiwi and a triangle can only be used by Buy New Zealand Made members, who pay a licence fee to do so. Retailers such as Countdown employ voluntary COOL on their house brand products, as well as fresh and single ingredient whole foods. Now a John Banks update. Former MP John Banks is not ruling anything in or anything out following his acquittal, including standing for the Auckland mayoralty, despite saying he's not sure any political party would want him. He will take legal advice about any further action or costs, but says there is no compensation for what he's been through. The Court of Appeal earlier today acquitted Mr Banks and ruled he should not be retried for allegedly filing a false electoral return. In April, the President of the Court of Appeal, Justice Alan France, ordered a hearing on whether Mr Banks should be retried. She'd earlier ruled that he should be retried following the appeal court's quashing of his conviction for knowingly filing a false electoral return after disclosing donations from internet entrepreneur Kim.com as anonymous. Today, a Court of Appeal judgment from Justice France, Forrest Miller and John Wild has cancelled the retrial order and acquitted Mr Banks. In a press conference this afternoon, Mr Banks says he's been to hell and back over the past 3 years. He said, "Truth has prevailed at a huge cost to my family and with so much stress and so much oppression to myself." He said, crying, "You've got no idea how lonely this has been." Mr Banks says he will take legal advice about any recourse, but says money is not the issue, despite the process costing him enough to financially destroy a lesser person. He will not rule out standing for Auckland Mayor, but says a return to Parliament seems unlikely. Mr Banks called the Crown's withholding of evidence, as found by the Court of Appeal, to be a serious error of judgment. He said some of the mistakes made by the judiciary going through were outrageous. The Solicitor General has a lot to answer for, he said. He says the court action hasn't helped his marriage and that he regrets not being an MP this morning. But he rules out any court action against Mr.com, saying he wouldn't be bothered. The decision comes just weeks after Mr Banks' lawyer David Jones QC filed an application for the appeal court to recall its decision to retry Mr Banks after he received fresh material from the Crown about a contentious lunch at the .com mansion. In January, Crown Law said the evidence of two American businessmen who say they were present at Kim.com's mansion when Mr Banks and his wife were there needed to be tested in court. The appeal court found the evidence of new witnesses could have affected the outcome of the case. The businessmen said donations were not discussed at that lunch at Mr.com's mansion. Mr Banks says, "I can honestly say I haven't been back to the mansion for lunch."
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
In business news, the Better Drinks Company, previously known as Charlie's, has turned in a small profit for the 2014 financial year while leaning on its Japanese parent for financial support. According to financial statements made public this week, the Asahi-owned juice and beverage firm reported a profit of $134,000 for the year to December 31st. This was up from a small loss of $15,000 in 2013 and was derived from operating revenue of $31.45 million compared to $30.5 million in 2013. The income statement shows selling, distribution and marketing expenses increased during the year, but administration expenses fell. Current liabilities of $47.7 million is mostly related to party debt and exceeds current assets pegged at $15.5 million as at December 31st. Notes to the accounts highlight that a loan from Asahi Holdings of $44.2 million was renewed on March 20 this year. Asahi has confirmed it will not seek repayment of the loan for the foreseeable future. Charlie's was started 14 years ago and was bought by Asahi in 2011 for $130 million, following a takeover offer to shareholders of the then NZX-listed company. The Better Drinks Company's products include the well-known Charlie's and Phoenix brand names. In People News, a former Belgrave finance director is more interested in spending time with his family rather than securing assets for them now he's been released from prison. In June 2013, Stephen Charles William Smith was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in jail after pleading guilty to 25 charges for his role in an $18 million fraud relating to the collapse of Belgrave Finance in 2008. Smith, 46, was granted parole less than 18 months into his sentence, a decision obtained by NBR Radio. Smith appeared before the parole board in August last year and was released on September 15. The board's decision says Smith learned about tolerance, patience and humility in prison. He was driven to work long hours to secure assets for his family in the past, but those values have changed. The decision says he now tells us he's more interested in spending time with his family and enjoying the small pleasures of life. The board heard Smith was a polite inmate who got on well with staff and others. He was employed at the mill, which he kept himself busy with while incarcerated. The decision says his broadened skills will help him find future employment. He is deeply ashamed and embarrassed about his offending. The board granted Smith's release to a withheld address, but barred him from being involved in the management or finances of any company. Smith pleaded guilty in April 2013 to charges of theft by a person in a special relationship, 4 charges of false statement by promoter, 1 charge of making an untrue statement, and 1 charge of making a false statement to a trustee. He was jailed for his role in a number of transactions between June 2005 and March 2008 for the benefit of related entities of Belgrave, following a prosecution by the SFO and FMA. Belgrave, which provided finance for property developments from funds raised via debentures and capital notes, was put in receivership in May 2008, owing $22 million to about 1,000 investors. Charges were also laid against former director Shane Buckley, the alleged controller of the company, Raymond Schofield, and legal advisor Hugh Hamilton. Buckley was sentenced to 3 years jail after pleading guilty in August 2012, while Schofield was granted a stay of prosecution on the grounds of terminal illness. Hamilton, a former Central Hawke's Bay mayor, was sentenced to 4 years and 9 months in jail last year. In court news, former Allied Farmers boss Rob Allaway has returned to court to seek freezing orders over what he says should be his relationship property. In March, a judge allowed Mr. Allaway to continue his High Court fight for various assets he says he gave to his former fiancée, Jane Bond. The pair, who broke up about 2 years ago, have 2 young children together. The assets included an engagement ring valued at about $45,000, although that claim has been set to one side since Ms. Bond sold the ring. Before Justice Kit Toogood in the High Court at Auckland, Mr. Allaway, who's representing himself, said he wants freezing orders over various luxury watches, a pair of diamond earrings, furniture and chattels valued around $55,000, an iPhone, an iPad and 2 Louis Vuitton bags. Mr. Allaway makes his High Court claim under a rarely used piece of legislation, the Domestic Actions Act. That law relates especially to broken engagements and broadly says that if an engagement is broken, parties must return to their original position, meaning gifts must be returned. Mr. Allaway and Ms. Bond have concurrent proceedings in the family court. In that case, they disagree over whether they were together for the requisite 3 years to trigger relationship property rules. And for more of what happened in court, please go to nbr.co.nz.
NBR Radio with the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 16th. I'm John Stewart. And I'm joined for Property Talk by Chris Hutching on the line from Christchurch, and here in the studio in Auckland with me is Sally Lindsay. Now, Sally, can you first talk to us about an apartment which has produced a surprisingly low yield?
This was in Grafton, and the apartment is on top of 2 commercial properties. And apparently the previous owner had done it up to a very, very good state. So when people went round to look at the property, they noticed the apartment more than the commercial shops. And while it hadn't been rented out, the agent selling it got an indication of the rent it would yield, and it was about $800 a week. And they thought the buyers had priced that in separately to the other 2 commercial premises on the bottom, which were only returning $45,000 a year in rent. So when it came to the auction, it went berserk. There were 40 buyers there.
Good heavens. And
they priced in that apartment, because it's very, very posh apparently, and came up with a $2.5 million price for the whole property, which is unusual. And there were 8,000 people looking at it on the website, where in fact usually you only get 50 to 100 people looking at commercial properties. And 250 people turned up to the open homes, which is quite unusual on top of a commercial premises. But as the agent says, this is like gold, this property in Auckland. You don't get them very often. And someone had the foresight to do this 2-bedroom apartment, and they've reaped the benefit from it.
But are they local owners?
Yes, apparently they're a family trust.
Right.
Maybe associated with one of the commercial premises below.
Now, Chris, to you next, and you've got some news for us about Tony Quinn, the racing car enthusiast, and Rich Lister. Tell us more.
Yes, Tony is an interesting character, Scottish-born. He's I suppose we call him a racing car entrepreneur. He has just purchased the Hampton Downs circuit near Te Kuara for 15 mil, and he says he's going to spend another 25. I mean, these guys talk big numbers, but even if we pull them back a little bit, it's obviously a sizable investment.
Yeah.
And he's going to develop more business facilities around it, such as a business park. I think there are some apartments already on the go as well, which have got nice views of the racetrack, so motorheads can go there and they can stay in their apartment for the weekend and they can watch these races from their apartment. Pretty bizarre, eh?
Yeah.
And he's also done something else in Queenstown. He's set up a go-kart facility there at Remarkables Park, which is near the airport, and that's a $7 million venture.
Wow.
It's an indoor thingy for families. They can go along there and you can go up ramps and tunnels and all sorts of things like that. And that's going to be part of a wider entertainment precinct that the developer of Remarkables Park, the Porter Group, is putting together.
Right.
Hampton Downs Park is quite amazing. You drive past it on the main road down to Hamilton, and there are always people there racing cars.
Really?
And there's actually a lot of apartments there already, and they're all fully occupied.
Sounds like quite a sensible investment decision.
Yes, it's very. It's a very busy one, and it's a bit of a feather in his cap. He does have another one called Highlands at Cromwell, which is very popular. It gets a lot of tourist traffic through it. The same sort of thing, family entertainment. He has got his eye on another one at Taupo, but there's a few problems there. The shareholders aren't too willing to sell it to him at the moment.
Now, this Porter Group you mentioned in passing on the outskirts of Queenstown, I think near the airport.
Yes.
It's they. Is it they who you were talking about last week who are planning, have offered to build a convention centre there?
Yes, that's the case, and it's in the same area, the same sort of large precinct called Remarkables Park, where they want to do this. And the council are a bit miffed about this because, as we discussed last week, they've got their own plans for one in the middle of town. But
right.
The Porter Group is saying, look, we don't want any taxpayer money. We'll do it. We'll do it for Queenstown. Well, they're obviously going to do it for themselves as well. But there we go. So they're about to lodge a resource consents for that, and it'll be very interesting to see how it's opposed.
Mm. Just before we go off the subject, where's this Tony Quinn based?
Tony is... he gets around a lot.
Right.
Whenever I ring him, he's in Australia, where he's also got racing car interests. He's got a circuit over there as well. So he comes to New Zealand. I think he's in New Zealand for the coming month or two.
Right.
He told me that he had dual nationality. He's also got properties in the United States. So he's a busy boy. He gets about.
He certainly is. Now, Sally, you've been investigating Century 21, who are big-time real estate agents.
They are. A guy called Charles Darby, originally from Lebanon, owns it, or he was born in Australia, but his parents are Lebanese.
Right.
He owns all the franchises throughout Australia and New Zealand, which is quite an achievement.
How many would that be?
That's 300 franchises. So I had
Good
breakfast
heavens.
with him on Saturday morning. He was over here to hand out awards for his top agents, which is a regular occurrence in these agencies these days. And he had some interesting things to say about the property market, Sydney compared to Auckland, which he reckons both are very similar.
Oh, really?
And the house prices are going up at pretty much the same rate. The same things attract people to houses in both of these markets, and he doesn't see the house price fiasco not stopping. He says it's going to carry on. And
so
he
we're
said,
not
well,
talking
it's
about
just-
bubbles bursting
No,
then?
he says there's no bubbles. It's just purely a supply and demand issue, and he said a lot of it is pent up after the GFC and no one invested any money or developed anything, and people are now they're letting in immigration into both countries, although it's a lot easier to get into New Zealand than it is in Australia. But still, they have their problems with immigration as well. And one of the banks in New South Wales did a survey and found that 21% of people applying for money were foreign to buy houses. In New Zealand, we have no figures on that, but anecdotally it's about 10%. And he said the sort of most interesting thing is that really a lot of the market is driven by hype, people panicking because everyone's talking about it, panicking that they're not in the market, they don't own a house, and then it's all self-fulfilling.
Yeah, it's the old role of sentiment and matters of
Yes.
money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
So
we have to keep in mind that Charles, of course, is a part of that fueling of that bubble because that's his business. So I'll keep the
Indeed.
number next to my desk, and when the bubble bursts, I'll give him a buzz and ask him what he thinks is going on.
He did say that he did temper that with saying that you should not go into the housing market just for the sake of it. Said that's the wrong decision.
now, Chris, finally and briefly, you've been having a look at retirement villages.
Well, this is based on another study that Jones Lang LaSalle's researchers did, and they just had a look at the ageing population and cracked a few numbers, and basically came at the conclusion that there's heaps of opportunity there for providers of retirement villages yet, because there has been some talk in the market, how many villages can you build? We've got, big players, Ryman, Bupa, Somerset, that sort of person. Probably one of the interesting things which came out of it, the way that there are some slight dynamics changing. People are going into these retirement homes at an older age, less likely to go in until their 70s rather than late 60s, which takes account of improving health and that sort of thing, people staying in their communities longer. I would suspect, personally, I would think that maybe that trend might increase. We might get people staying in their own homes longer, but we'll see. They do seem to be very popular, and the way that they report them anyway, guys like companies like Ryman, they seem to be on a bit of an unstoppable upward curve still.
Indeed. And can we just very briefly refer to rural property? Still looking healthy, is it, Chris?
Yeah, it is. It's a bit of a mystery to a lot of us, I guess, because we've had the downturn in the dairying, but the prices do seem to be remaining fairly firm. They've come off a little bit on a monthly basis over the last couple of months, but not significantly. When I say they've come off a little bit, maybe in one or two areas, but in some of the most popular dairying areas, they still seem to be holding up. So, this dairy thing, if it's going to be a crash or a bubble, it's still yet to show up in property prices, which still seem
Indeed.
quite firm.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up there, but Sally Lindsay in Auckland, Chris Hutching in Christchurch, thanks for your contribution to Property Talk today.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
I'm Grant Walker with Heads Up. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Dairy prices fall again. Phil O'Reilly quits Business New Zealand. Inflation expectations rise. Rich Lister questions the government over housing. Rob Alloway continues his fight with his ex. Another viewpoint on the Auckland housing crisis and your viewpoint on IRD's tactics. If you're travelling today, Auckland fine spells, Wellington cloudy with the odd shower, Christchurch and Dunedin fine. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. Tax and charities. A new report has shone a light on New Zealand's charity sector and found some 700 limited liability companies on the charities register generate more than $370 million in tax-exempt profits a year. The Giving Charities a Helping Hand report, put together by the New Zealand Initiative, calculates as a result of this the government forgoes about $104 million in fiscal revenue a year. New Zealand Initiative Research Fellow Jason Krupp says long-standing rules allow the for-profit arms of some charities to retain earnings tax-free. He says there is little oversight from regulators as to how much money is actually distributed to charities. Mr Krupp is calling for the removal of the tax advantage enjoyed by the for-profit arm of charity groups. He says current rules are stacked against smaller operators while allowing commercial arms of large charities to claim income tax exemptions with little oversight. He says some of these businesses retain a lot of their profits without paying any tax on it and only distributing a small part of it to charity. Mr Krupp gives the example of Ngāi Tahu, which he says has roughly 38 business units, all of which are registered charities and none of them pay any income tax. He says, during our research, we found Ngāi Tahu made about $160 million in tax-free profits in 1 year and only distributed about 20% of that to its charity. That means there is more than $130 million hanging around the balance sheet that's tax-free. It has the potential to create an unfair competitive landscape. He says Ngāi Tahu operates under registered charitable status, pays no income tax on any profits retained within the business, potentially giving it a significant advantage over tax-paying competitors. Earlier this year, NBR reported the registered Christian charity Parachute Music was producing the backing music for The X Factor. Mike Rudd, director of tax accounting firm Staples Rodway, told NBR Radio, although it's not as simple as Parachute undercutting competition due to tax exemptions, the charity could reduce costs in other ways. Mr Krupp says there is little oversight of how some cultural or religious charities spend these funds, simply because the legislation allows religious and cultural organisations to get a free pass. For more on this, go to nbr.co.nz. To dairy prices. Dairy product prices fell for the fifth consecutive GDT auction, pushing the GDT price index to its lowest level since August 2009 and adding to the pressure on 1 in 4 dairy farmers the Reserve Bank says have negative cash flow this season. The GDT average winning price fell 2.2% to US 2472 from 2515 at the previous auction 2 weeks ago. Some 26,500 tonnes of product was sold, down from just over 27,000 in the previous auction. Low prices are seen as one of 3 key risks to New Zealand's financial stability if they were to persist, the Reserve Bank said in its financial stability report last week. Governor Graham Wheeler told Parliament's Finance and Expenditure Committee that another year of low prices would be a worry for the economy. The New Zealand dollar recently traded at 73.4 US from 73.6 before the auction results were released. Whole milk powder, the biggest product by volume offered on the GDT platform, fell 0.5% to US 239 a tonne, slowing from the 1.8% decline in the previous auction, while taking its decline since last February to 27%. Buttermilk rose 3.2% a tonne. Rennet casein fell 0.4% a tonne. Skim milk powder declined 3.6%. And anhydrous milk fat dropped 4.8% a tonne. Butter fell 3.2% and cheddar fell 7.1%. Sweet whey powder was not offered at the latest event, while lactose rose 0.9% to $5.80 a tonne. There were 128 winning bidders out of 162 participating bidders at the 14-round auction. The number of qualified bidders rose to 687 from 685 at the last auction. To the housing market, Century 21 Australasian owner Charles Tarby believes New Zealand's residential property market is not in a boom, just a correction after the global financial crisis flattened prices and sales for several years. He says strong growth in both Auckland's and Sydney's residential markets is because of the cyclical nature of real estate and low interest rates. Mr. Tarby says it's not, as many people believe, caused solely by foreign investment. Sydney does not have any houses within a 20-kilometre radius of the city under 1 million, and Auckland has 31 $1 million suburbs, 8 created in just 6 months. Mr. Tarby says major investment in the past few years has been from the UK and US, with China coming in behind. Because he says there is such a strong Asian physical presence in both cities, people jump to the conclusion it's Chinese buyers pushing prices up. In Sydney, Mr. Tarby says many of the buyers are Chinese Australian-born citizens, although the National Bank of Australia recently recorded a 21% increase in demand in New South Wales coming from offshore buyers and 15% nationally. New Zealand does not keep figures, but anecdotally it's believed about 10% of residential buyers are foreign. Mr. Tarby says the market dynamics in New Zealand or Australia are not going to change anytime soon unless the US and China economies crash and consumer sentiment hits the floor. There is an exodus of people and money from the Asian region as the middle class grows. India, he says, has a massive interest in New Zealand, and there will be more investment from there. New Zealand needs population growth and investment, he says, as does Australia, and the rules and regulations for gaining residency are far easier in New Zealand than Australia. He says if both countries make it harder for foreigners to invest in property, they may not be there to support the market in a downturn or when both countries need their investment most. The New Zealand government is introducing a capital gains tax on any houses bought and sold within 2 years and is requiring non-residents buying and selling any property other than their main home to have a New Zealand bank account and provide an IRD number. In Australia, foreign investment rules have been under scrutiny, with the Foreign Investment Review Board proposing steep application fees for offshore buyers and jail time for developers who solely advertise their projects offshore. Mr. Tarby says this is ironic as banks in both countries require a 50 to 60% sell down off the plans before money is released to build new apartment developments, and developers have always had to sell offshore to get the required numbers. He said if governments are going to have rules and regulations around foreign buyers, they need to come up with clear, transparent policies based on accurate data. Understanding what is actually happening is the first step before any new taxes. He says foreign investors want to buy in Auckland and Sydney because of the geography, water, climate, safety, government structure and infrastructure. It's made easy in both countries. In China, he says to buy a second property, buyers need a 50% deposit, and to buy a third house, it must be a cash deal. They're happy to invest in Australasia even if the interest rates are 3 to 6% compared to 1 to 2% in their own region. He says the cold hard fact is both countries need their money and they don't need ours. China has built cities that are not even occupied. However, Mr. Tarby, who owns all 300 Century 21 franchises across Australia and New Zealand and is turning over 20 to 30 million a year, says getting into the housing market for the sake of it is a sideshow and a bad choice.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 19th. I'm John Stewart. The focus of the news this week is on the budget and the size of the deficit. One of the biggest contributors to the reduction in the budget deficit is the money not being spent on welfare. In his editor's insight on Tuesday, Neville Gibson says this is a success story you don't hear much about. Neville, why are you describing this as a success story?
Well, if you believe a lot of the talk around from the opposition, you think that the more the government's going to be spending on welfare, the better. But like the ACC reforms, where the fees are being cut all the time due to changes there, the savings in welfare benefits are a bit like a tax cut for all other taxpayers. And this has been drawn to my attention by a column in the Australian newspaper by Rick Morton, and he was praising New Zealand for the way that the benefit numbers have been reducing since 2012, and in his column he says that the people on benefits has fallen by 12%, And the calculations which he's drawn from New Zealand figures show that this is worth 650,000 years of benefit receipts over the next 5 decades.
Good heavens, that's an impressive number. So how is it possible?
Well, 2/3 of it has come from people who gain benefits, and one is the reduction in the time they spend on them from his analysis of the figures. And what this really means is that the future liability of welfare recipients has dropped from 86 billion down to 76 billion in 2003, falling even further to 69 billion last year. Now, there are some reasons like inflation, it's been taken out of the equation, but 2.2 billion of this came from just the sheer number of people on the benefits going off them.
Now, you say that he's analysed New Zealand figures. What figures are these?
Well, yesterday the Social Welfare Minister, Anne Tolley, brought out the latest, they call it the Benefit System Performance Report. And this isn't the figures that Mr Morton was doing, but they sort of base up his conclusions. Now, actuaries get to work on all this sort of thing and they extrapolate what's going on. But in the latest report, they say that 2.2 billion in savings is also accompanied by a drop in liability for sole parents of around about 3.3 billion. Now, Mrs Tolley says this shows that there are 38,000 fewer people on benefits compared with 3 years ago, and the number of children in benefit-dependent households has fallen by almost 42,000 over the same period. Now, a lot of people probably say the government's cutting corners, but in fact it's quite a different story when you look at just how this is being achieved.
So how are they achieving this reduction?
Well, the government calls it the investment approach to reducing welfare dependence. It means that it's spending more money up front on each case, and it saves money in the long term through intensive management. This is very similar to what they achieved at the ACC. Now, the ministry believes the value gained from applying this approach could be put to work across the whole social sector. In fact, this is the same approach that the Productivity Commission reached a conclusion when it did social services delivery. That was a report they delivered a few weeks ago. And it says there should be a lot more coordination among the agencies and a lot more information on why certain people become welfare dependent.
Well, what can be done about that long-term dependency?
Well, when the Productivity Commission looked at this, it recommended that more be done by the private sector. It was interested in squeezing more juice or efficiencies out of the public sector. But it also raised the question of social impact bonds. Now, I didn't know much about these bonds when the Commission first brought it up, but we've now got the benefits of a report that came out last week from the local think tank, the New Zealand Initiative, that's the former Round Table. And it has also, there's a pilot running at the Ministry of Health. I'm not quite sure of the details of that. They haven't actually said so. But essentially these bonds raise money from the private sector, and there's a lot of foundations and private money interested in social programs. They contract to deliver social services, and if they reach the goals or exceed them, they get not just what the government was going to pay them for the contract, but they get a benefit on top. And so far these social impact bonds, which took off in United Kingdom in 2012, or was it 2010? Anyway, a few years ago, but they tackle specific areas like public safety, recidivism, rough sleeping, even at-risk children and asthma and that sort of thing. So this is maybe working out probably not quite as well in practice as in theory, but it's an experiment that's worth looking at.
Indeed it is. Neville, thanks very much for this Tuesday's Editor's Insight.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebrett.com. NBR Radio.
In housing news, NBR Rich List property investor Simon Henry is questioning why the government needs to compete with private housing providers. He was commenting on an announcement last week that Fletcher Living will build 200 high-density dwellings at 36 Wells Street and 350 Colombo Street in central Christchurch. Mr Henry also has a housing venture underway in the inner suburb of St Martin's, where builders are completing several townhouse-style homes. The properties where Fletcher will deliver homes were acquired by the City Council in 2008 from developer Dave Henderson as part of a controversial $18 million bailout, which was ultimately pointless given his subsequent bankruptcy a couple of years later. The City Council acquired 36 Wells Street for $4.6 million and 350 Colombo for $2.7 million in late 2008. The prices were also controversial because fewer commercial sales were taking place as the GFC was beginning to be felt, and it's unlikely a buyer would have emerged for several years. Now, the national government has negotiated the purchase by the Crown of the properties for an undisclosed price it says is fair value. After a tender process, Fletcher Living was chosen to deliver 191 new dwellings on the properties over the next 2 years. The Colombo and Wells developments will include apartments and terraced houses with communal spaces and retail space on the ground floor. And Fletcher Building is also constructing 237 new homes in Christchurch in the Awatea Cars Road housing development on the outer fringe of the city near the southern motorway. 89 of the homes will be at a purchase price of less than $400,000. 50 will involve shared equity ownership with the New Zealand Housing Foundation to assist families into home ownership. The first homes were scheduled to be completed in the first half of 2015 and 10 homes built a month over a 2-year period, with the development fully completed by 2017. The initiatives follow the first state-private mixed tenure housing New Zealand development underway in Christchurch at 399 Manchester Street in the central city. Auckland building company Legacy is carrying out that $3.3 million development. The arrangement involves Legacy buying the site from Housing New Zealand and then building 26 units. Housing New Zealand will then buy 11 of the units, and the remaining 15 will be offered to private investors. The venture was optimistically scheduled for completion by the end of 2014, but building is well underway now. Mr. Henry says he doesn't understand why the government needs to be involved as developer of homes. He said the Labour Party must be impressed. National has stolen its thunder, and it means I'm competing with the state. Meanwhile, Mr. Henry is subdividing and selling down an industrial property at Belfast, north of Christchurch. He's also refurbished the ex-Rockpool building at 85 Hereford Street near Worcester Boulevard in the Christchurch Central Business District and will soon market it for sale. He recently sold the 1,352 square metre 152 Hereford Street to Tim Glasson for $2.4 million for his ANZ Centre, which will also house a Glasson store on the ground floor and Hallenstein's on level 1 on the corner of High and Cashel Streets. In business news, NZAX-listed TruScreen will seek to raise up to $4 million to ramp up manufacturing of its single-use sensors as it targets China. Now its cervical cancer screen system has won regulatory approval to service the world's most populous nation. The Auckland-based company said in a statement it wants to raise between $3 to $4 million through a private placement to institutions and eligible shareholders and a share purchase plan to existing investors, and will go on a roadshow in New Zealand and Australia over the next week. The capital raising plans come after it said yesterday it has signed up to a joint initiative with the China Doctors Association and its principal Chinese distributor to run a screening program spanning 100,000 people in 100 hospitals over the next 12 to 14 months. That deal was hot on the heels of TruScreen winning regulatory approval to sell its product into China by the China Food and Drug Administration. The company said this development has opened up significant commercial opportunities for TruScreen and for its commercial distribution partners in China to maximise the commercial opportunity to market and distribute TruScreen's product primarily in China, but also in a number of other jurisdictions. The board of the company considers that it's appropriate for the company to engage in a capital raising initiative. TruScreen listed on the NZAX last November in a compliance listing, having already raised $6.07 million in the lead-up to going public. That private placement was to acquire the intellectual property and business assets of the business and provide working capital to fund the commercialisation of the product. The company today said it hasn't set a price for the private placement or share purchase plan, but expects it will be close to the market price in the period immediately before the completion of the capital raise. The shares last traded at 30 cents apiece, valuing the company at $43.3 million, 3 times the 10-cent issue price when it listed last year. The funds will go toward increasing production to meet the demands of its distribution partners, setting up tooling and manufacturing facilities for the new model of its TruScreen device, stockpile inventory, invest in research and development, conduct clinical trials, and invest in sales and marketing. To your opinion, NBR online readers say the use of covert visits, including staff posing as customers and doing business walk-bys, are an important part of Inland Revenue's arsenal against tax-evading businesses. On Monday, NBR Radio revealed IRD investigators are using undercover investigation techniques to look into potential compliance issues. It did not respond to questions about the specifics of the investigations, how widespread they may be, or how much it costs. Documents show an IRD investigator's evidence against a business over cash reporting and tax compliance includes notes from cover visits and walk-bys. The notes are extensive, counting staff numbers, customer numbers, stock, as well as cash and FPOS transactions and how they're handled. About 90% of the visits were covertly conducted. Specialist tax lawyer Jeff Clues, who has more than 30 years' experience, says he probably had about 6 cases in the past 2 or 3 years in which evidence was gathered undercover by the IRD. He says he does not find the practice surprising and believes most taxpayers will be happy to see non-compliant entities investigated in such a way for the purposes of recovering tax. And 79% of NBR online readers agree, saying the covert tactics are an important part of the IRD's investigations. One reader commented, "Tax evaders are criminals and should be treated as such. If they have nothing to hide, then no problem." An IRD spokeswoman says it has systems, tools and techniques to help determine the best action to take when investigating potential compliance issues. The spokeswoman says to protect the integrity of our work, we would not disclose specifics about the techniques and methods we use. What we can say is we tailor our approach depending on the particular circumstances to ensure taxpayers meet their tax obligations. Last week, the IRD heralded the early success of its Declare It All or Risk Everything campaign, which is a crackdown on ensuring tradies declare cash jobs or cashies. The campaign, which has identified tradespeople as being a high-risk sector for tax evasion, is running in Auckland's Flatbush, Takanini, Silverdale and Albany suburbs, but may be rolled out to other areas. Last year, the IRD got back about $6 for every dollar invested in its hidden economy program. The spokeswoman says it encourages people to talk to the IRD early on if they're facing tax difficulties. The spokeswoman says it's very difficult to get away with not meeting your tax obligations.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.